So I've been talking about anxiety for a while. It's interesting because, I've wanted to do a series on anxiety for a long, long time. Originally, I thought this was going to be one message in a series, and then it turned into multiple messages in a series, and it keeps going on. The reason I avoided doing this is because I knew it would be a very complex subject, and I felt a little anxious about the subject of anxiety. Because I knew you couldn't just... It's the number one thing in America today in terms of mental illness. Number one, rapidly growing. And unfortunately, if you struggle with anxiety and you are a Christian, then there's another whole element wrapped up in that. Here's what one man said about it. He said, when I first tried to talk to other Christians about my anxiety, I was met with very caring, but also dismissive responses that I just needed to have more faith. He said, in Christianity, we are afraid to talk about anxiety because we don't want to look like bad Christians. He is so right. In nearly 30 years of being in church work, he is so accurate about that. You cannot be a good Christian and struggle with anxiety. That's the teaching of the church, and that's how people act. And so what that does is it adds shame and guilt to something that's already incredibly painful for people. And so what they end up doing is they hide it. So you sit with people every single week, and you have for your whole life, who struggle with anxiety, and you will never know because they don't want to be viewed as a bad Christian or get a little pithy saying from you about, well, you just got to trust God more. So they don't want the extra shame and guilt piled onto something that's already extremely painful to them. This is the reality. But anxiety actually plays a kind of important role in your life, and we've been talking about this. Anxiety is just your body's natural response to perceived danger. That's all it is. So imagine the scenario. Let's say that you are out somewhere this next week, and you are in a store, and you get out late or at work late, and you come out to a dark parking lot, and there's no other car around except yours, and you're walking to your car, and it's pitch black, and right as you get close to your car, you see someone step out from behind a bush nearby. And they're a big person, they got a black trench coat on, they get their hands in their pockets, and they start walking right toward your car as you're about to get into your car in the middle of the night, alone. You're going to feel some anxiety, right? And the anxiety is just your body saying, hey, you're in danger. You're in danger. Now, maybe you are, and maybe you aren't, right? More than likely you're not. Because maybe what they pull out of their pocket is a Dunkin' Donut, and they start eating. Maybe they pull a tract out, and they start telling you about Jesus. It's like, you picked the worst spot to do that, right? But it could be anything. They don't have to pull a gun. But your body in that moment is saying, you're in danger here. Be careful. That's what anxiety does. You're in danger. And there are plenty of times where that's appropriate. If you're going to go swimming in shark-infested waters, you should feel some anxiety. Your body is appropriately telling you, hey, you're kind of in danger here. You should, that's actually a pretty good thing. We've said for weeks now, your anxiety system is like an alarm on your car. An alarm on your car has a good purpose. It's intended to tell you, hey, somebody's trying to break in and steal this thing. You should stop them. You should call the police. That's a good purpose. But if your car alarm starts going off when the rain starts to fall, that's a bad thing. That's not how it was intended to be used. And just like that, your anxiety system in your body can be reset to go off when you're not actually in danger. So we've been also saying, think of it like this. It's like you have a dial inside of you, and this is your anxiety dial. There are people in this world whose anxiety dial never really moves off of off. You know them. They fear nothing. Courageous about everything. They don't even hesitate when risk is in front of them. They just go. It's because their dial never goes very high. But there are also people whose dial never moves below 5 or 6. They always feel anxious. In other words, their body is telling them, you're in danger, even when nothing is dangerous around them. There are people who live that way. And then there are people whose dial just goes to 8, 9, or 10 for no reason at all. And they feel anxious and in danger when, again, nothing's wrong. So you have these extremes on the anxiety scale. You literally have people who right now have so much anxiety and their body is telling them they are in danger when they're really not. And there are biological causes like we've talked about. There are some people that their brain is producing too much of one chemical or not enough of another one. And so there's a biological cause for some people. And there's situational causes. I heard this last week that 90% of Americans have anxiety at the thought of public speaking. 90% of Americans. So there's a situational component. Sometimes you only feel really anxious when you're asked to do something. And again, I know that I've said, if I were to ask you to come up and finish this sermon, just follow my notes, some of you would immediately have that dial get spun up pretty high at the idea of standing up in front of a crowd and speaking. So it's situational. That's what makes anxiety so complicated. It's just not black and white, it's not simple, and that's why our pithy little answer about, well, just trust God more, is so painful to people whose dial is spun up higher than yours. It's not okay to say that to them. It's just really not. We need to be understanding, we need to help, we need to understand what's going on, and then there are real causes for this, and here's the best part of this. The thing I'm going to say over and over again is that it's completely treatable. I have been studying anxiety now for 4 weeks. I've been listening to podcasts, and I've been reading and reading and reading from psychologists of all kinds of fields, some Christian, some not, and over again, there hasn't been a single one that says, oh, well, if you got anxiety and it's spun up higher, sucks to be you, nothing will ever change. Nobody says that. They all say, people who deal with this for a living say, it's treatable. It's treatable, it's treatable. And that's really important news because Wall Street Journal reported this recently. 40 million Americans suffer from anxiety disorders. 40 million Americans. But only 36% of those ever get help. Only 1/3 of the people who know, some of you know anxiety is an issue in your life and it's causing issues, but only 1/3 of people who deal with anxiety get help. That's sad because it's treatable. And if you don't get help, then anxiety makes your life smaller. It's going to limit your life and destroy your health. It's going to take away the joy that God wants you to have. You will not experience the life God has for you. Because here's the thing I want you to know, is so much of the adventure that God has for you is on the other side of anxiety. And if you don't learn how to move past the anxiety, you miss the experiences that God has for you. I'll show you some of that in my message today. And that's not what I want for you. It's not what God wants for you. And this is completely treatable. You can learn how your dial was spun up for reasons. It can be spun down. So we're in this series called How to Hold It Together. And we're going to talk again today about anxiety, and we're going to continue. What do you do when you're feeling anxious? So I want to ask you to open your program, take out the notes that you'll find inside, grab a pen. There are going to be some things you're going to write down, and you can see I have 2 things on here. Sorry, this is going to go another week. This is the #1 issue in America, and I cannot rush through these things. People all across America are struggling with this, and there's no way to do it fast. So I had planned to finish this week, and I just can't. So, because I'm not rushing it. There's just too much to say about this, and this is such a serious issue in America. There's just no way to rush it. So we're just gonna do the first part of your notes here, and we'll finish this next week. Oh, I hope. So here we go. So we've been talking about triggers. What causes what's the underlying cause for our anxiety? So trigger number 2, we talked about trigger number 1 last week. Trigger number 2 is the threat of not being able to control what affects us. And so the question that you need to ask is, who has control over you? It was an interesting way to word that question, and I didn't come up with that, by the way. One of the things I told you a couple of weeks ago when I started doing research on this, I found my favorite Christian psychologist is a guy named Dr. Henry Cloud. I read all of his books. I'm on his podcast. I'm subscribed to his monthly thing, so I get to all these videos. And he did a seminar on anxiety, and it was so instrumental in shaping what I'm talking to you about. Matter of fact, if you hear anything good in this whole series, just assume it came from him, because it probably did. So he was the one, based on his clinical research and experience, that talked about here are the underlying causes of major anxiety in people's lives. And when he got to this one, he said this is #1 in his personal experience. When he's counseling people who are highly anxious, this is the issue. It's control. And here's what he said. It's the #1 source of anxiety in people's lives. So he said, think about this. What was your home life like when you were raised? Would you use the word chaotic in any way to describe the home that you were raised in? Or abusive? Did you have an alcoholic mom or dad? Did you face abandonment or uncertainty or instability? You know, in my family tree, my great-great-grandpa down my mom's side was a terrible, mean, violent man. One Christmas, one of the family stories is, he came in super drunk on Christmas Eve, gathered all the presents from under the tree, and left. And the next morning, his 3 kids woke up and they had nothing. Years later, they were playing in the barn in the attic and they found him up in the hayloft. He just did it to hurt his kids. So if you are raised in environments like that, or maybe you get into a relationship, a romantic relationship, and you are with somebody who's a little bit abusive or controlling or manipulative, there's so many situations in life where all of a sudden your system is set on alert every time dad walks in the door, right? Or every time you walk on the door. It's like you have to be on alert. Your body is appropriately telling you, oh my goodness, dad's been drinking, you are in danger. Right? That makes sense? It's the same thing what happens with soldiers overseas. You send a soldier overseas into a war zone, they better be on alert, right? Because they are in danger. And then all of a sudden, you go into these environments, you live in these environments, you're raised in this environment, you marry into an environment like this, and then all of a sudden you're out of the environment. Do you think that all of a sudden the dial just spins back? It doesn't. Your brain has been trained to think that you are in danger all the time, and you just carry that into life. That's what happens. And so when it comes to controlling, think about people in your life that have been really, really controlling. Again, some of you are raised with a very controlling mom or dad. Or maybe it was a grandma and grandpa and nobody crossed them. They controlled everything. They had an opinion about everything you wore and everything you said and everything you did and all of your dating choices and all of your your career choices, all of it. So what's behind that, according to the literature, is when people are afraid in those environments, is one of the outcomes of that is you can become very controlling because you've got to control what's happening in your world so that you don't get hurt anymore. Does that make sense? It's like, things were out of control, so I'm going to control everything so nobody gets to hurt me anymore. One psychologist put it this way: controlling behaviors often stem from anxiety. When things feel out of control, it's natural to want to control them in order to feel safe. But of course, we can't control other people and situations, so our efforts don't ultimately make us feel better. That's such an important point. I have known plenty of controlling people in my life, and I have never known a controlling person who's joyful. Ever. I've never known it. I could give you a list of controlling people I've met in my life, and I've never seen one that's joyful. It doesn't make them better. Trying to control other people is about the most pointless, worthless thing you can ever do, because you can't control them. You can become critical, and you can nag them, and you can complain, but you can't have any of those things and be joyful. The author went on to say, in fact, controlling behaviors usually create problems in our relationships. Isn't that true? Have you ever been in a relationship with someone who was highly controlling? Did you enjoy that? Did that make you feel good? It doesn't help them, and it doesn't help you. This author said it makes us feel frustrated and stressed out. But, again, it makes sense. When things feel out of control for people who have anxiety issues, one of the natural outcomes is, well, then I'm going to take control. I'm going to make things happen so that I am safe. And that's one of the natural outcomes. It's one of the major causes. Things felt out of control in my marriage. Things felt out of control in my childhood. So they are not going to be out of control now. I'm going to control them. And it doesn't work. I mean, the reality is, here's the reality about the only person in this world that I have some measure of control over. Right? And I can't even tell you that I'm fully in control of all of this. No shot, right? Have you ever met a perfectly self-controlled human being? Right? It's laughable. It made me laugh even saying the sentence. Nobody's perfectly in control of themselves. You don't perfectly control every thought in your head, every word out of your mouth. You would be a perfect human being if you controlled everything you ever said. And you don't. You can't even control yourself in the way you want to, but you're going to control somebody else? So the experts say, Here's how you begin to deal with this. So a couple of things. First, you need to examine your fears. What's driving this feeling of wanting to control somebody else? You're going to examine your fears, and there's some questions right on your notes that I'll give you a chance to write that down, and then we'll just go through these questions. So take a look at these. So here are the 3 questions. What are you afraid will happen if you can't control this situation or this person? What are you afraid is going to happen? Well, they're going to hurt me. Well, they're going to leave me. They're going to make a wrong choice. You know how many parents do that with their kids? They're going to make the wrong choice. Oh, well, you did 1 billion times. And here you are. So it's quite an issue in American parenting today. Are you catastrophizing or expecting the worst? And again, good question for parents who are overprotecting, over-controlling with their kids. Are you just expecting every outcome they make that's wrong is going to just destroy their life? Are you expecting the worst? And then what are the chances that this bad thing will really happen? Now that's a trick question. I'll warn you, that's a trick question. I have in my career, 30 years, I have had so much experience in talking to anxious people. And when the dial is spun up high and you ask these questions, what are you afraid of? Okay, they can tell you, well, I'm afraid of this, I'm afraid of this, I'm afraid of this. And then, are you expecting the worst? They'll tell you it's the worst. But then you ask them this, what are the chances that this bad thing that you're anticipating happening is actually going to happen? Do you know what they're going to say? Oh, it's possible. It's possible, because they actually believe the anxious thought. They have a hard time with that third question. It's a trick question for them. Now, you may be sitting there listening to, like, if a person actually believes that this Christmas tree is going to come alive and eat them, and they feel so much anxiety around Christmas trees, well, they believe that. They believe the anxious thought. So it's really challenging. I'm not trying to downplay the anxiety, but oftentimes what they say is, yeah, what I believe is actually going to happen. So some of you really relate to these questions. You know that these are some things that you struggle with. But then there's a second step that goes on from this. Is now you have to identify the situations that make you feel anxious. You examine the fears. What are the underlying fears that I have? And then you identify the situations. And again, this is for situational anxiety. There are people in this world who are so anxious about being rejected that they won't go on a date, because they're so afraid that the person's just going to say no, it's just going to end in heartbreak, and so they give into the anxiety. There are people who hate their job, but they're so anxious at the thought of applying for another job, and what if they find something worse, and what if the new boss is worse than the old boss, that they won't make a move even when it doesn't make sense to stay, because anxiety keeps them right there. What are the situations that make you feel anxious, that keep you stuck? I've been very open about the fact that I've been going to counseling for about 1.5 years now. And I was talking to my counselor about the subject of anxiety, and she told me about something called this. You ever heard of this? I'd never heard of it. Makes sense though. Exposure therapy. So the idea is, and here's what one author said, while avoiding situations that you feel anxious about can turn that dial down in the short term, you are teaching yourself in the long run that you can't handle those situations. You are retraining your brain to be afraid going forward, is what the author's saying. Ideally, you need to introduce to yourself in increasingly more amounts, more difficult situations, and you stay in those situations until the anxiety subsides. That's exposure therapy. So rather than avoiding the things that make you feel anxious, he says you need to move on. You know how you overcome the anxiety of public speaking? You do public speaking. So I was terrified when I first got started. Terrified. So anxious. Everybody is. I don't know anybody who isn't. Maybe there are some that aren't. I shouldn't say that, but I was. And then you do it for 30 years, and all of a sudden you don't feel anxious anymore, right? You move toward the thing that you're anxious about rather than avoiding it. Now, obviously, not every situation, right? Some of you are like, well, my dad, when he gets really drunk, becomes very, very violent, and man, I feel a lot of anxiety. Well, that's not a time for exposure therapy, okay? You don't go into the situation where there's violence or you are literally, seriously in danger. That's not what we're talking about. But in these other cases where anxiety is holding you back, you move toward it. And you can see this in the Bible. Because God loves people, he puts them, and this is really key for your spiritual future. God has an adventure planned for you. And you will know that you are starting to get close to it when you feel a little bit of anxiety. Because he has something big planned for you where he wants to partner with you to work in this world in some specific way, and you will only experience that on the other side of anxiety. You can see this with how he worked with people in the Bible. Do you know the story of Moses, this picture right here? Moses was raised in Pharaoh's household. But he's an Israelite, and so one day he decides to try and set his own people free by his own power. He kills a Roman. And he actually thought, the New Testament said, he thought that everyone would rise up and follow him. That's not what they did. They turned him in. They narked on him, and he has to run for his life, and he lives in exile for decades. And then one day he's out as a shepherd, and he really thinks his adventure with God is over. And one day he's out and he looks up on this hill, on this mountain, and there's a bush that's on fire, and the bush doesn't ever burn up. That doesn't happen. Throw a log on a fire and eventually it's gone, right? But this bush is on fire and it never burns up. And so he wants to see what this thing is. And so he hikes up the mountain, and God is in the fire. He can make fire with no heat. That doesn't consume anything. And he speaks to Moses from a bush on fire that's never consumed and says, I have a plan for you. You are going to go back to Pharaoh, the most powerful man on the planet. And you're going to walk into the palace of the Pharaoh of Egypt. And you're going to say to the Pharaoh, hey, God says, all these slaves of the nation of Israel, you're to set them free. That's what you're going to do. Now, if you know the story of what Moses does, Moses begins to argue with God. He's like, I'm not very good at speaking. Talk about anxiety over public speaking. Moses had it. He's like, and God says, that's okay. You're going to go anyway. Well, what if they don't believe me? Here's what you're going to do. And God gives him answer after answer. And finally, Moses literally says to God, send someone else. He's so anxious. He doesn't want to step into the adventure God has for him. And do you know what God says? God says, oh, well, if you're anxious, then you don't need to go. That's okay. I'll find someone else. That's all right. You're angry? Yeah, boy, this would be bad for you. God says, go. Just do what you feel anxious about doing. And God gives Moses a tremendous adventure. His faith and confidence and experiences with God go off the scale from that day on because he didn't give in to the anxiety. God is the ultimate exposure therapist because he has a plan for your life and a purpose for your life and an adventure for your life. And it's only going to be discovered on the other side of anxiety because it's not just simple. That's why it's so important to be constantly saying, God, what do you want from me? Now, for people who are anxious, that's like, I don't want to pray that prayer. But it's an adventure. It's a good thing that he has for you, not a bad thing, not to harm you. And you can trust him. So God does this. So then the third thing, the third part, we will edit that out. The third part of this is you focus on what you can control. And this was so interesting to me. I never really thought about this because when things feel out of control, anxiety goes high, right? And so what people don't do is they don't think about what they can actually control. What can you actually control? Dr. Cloud, in the seminar that I was watching, said he was working with Wall Street executives. Now, you can imagine Wall Street, how much control do you have about the stock market? Minimal control about the stock market. It goes up and it goes down. You can't predict what's going to happen in our future. COVID wipes out so much wealth and then it comes right back, right? You have no control over that. And so these Wall Street executives, many of them who came to see Dr. Cloud had high anxiety because your life is out of control. Your job, you have little to no control over the future of the stock market. And so how do executives dealing with Wall Street live without anxiety? He said one of the things he did with them is every day he made them sit down at their desk and make a list of the things they did have control over. Every day they would start their day with, what do I have control over? Well, I have control over the number of clients I call today, right? I control that. I have control over whether or not I develop a plan for good times or bad times. I control that. And he made them every day start their highly anxious lives with a list of what they do have control over. And here's what he discovered and what they learned. When powerlessness goes down, anxiety goes down. When powerlessness goes down, anxiety goes down. You're not powerless. There are things you can do. When powerlessness went down, their anxiety went down. Now, some of you are sitting here going, okay, Brian, how does this fit then when I have someone in my life who hurts me all the time? You've just told me I can't control that person. I am powerless to stop them from hurting me. So does that mean I'm just going to be anxious? Because powerlessness goes down, my anxiety goes down, but I'm powerless to change another human being who's hurting me. Good question. What you do, though, what you are capable of doing, unless you're a child, as an adult, you have the right to set boundaries, and boundaries reestablish your power. You can establish a boundary with somebody who's harming you. You can put up a boundary. We've talked about boundaries in the past. Boundaries are like, this is your yard, this is my yard. This fence is the delineator between what goes on in your life and what goes on in my life. And you are perfectly capable of setting boundaries to keep people who hurt you from hurting you. Years ago, I heard about a woman whose mom was highly critical. Every time she would call her mom and start talking about what she was doing or what she was excited about, her mom would immediately start criticizing it and telling her all the reasons why she was going to fail. So she'd get off the phone with her mom and just burst into tears and be so sad. And so finally, she learned this. She can't change her mom. She can't control her mom. So what she learned to do was, she put a boundary up. Every time her mom decided to start criticizing her and she started feeling like garbage about herself, she'd hang up the phone. She'd say, Mom, I gotta go. And she put a boundary up. And now all of a sudden, Mom doesn't get to harm her. She can have the best of the relationship with her mom without having the worst of the relationship with her mom. The moment she stepped into her yard, call's over. You can't control them. You can't stop them. But you don't have to be around it. And you don't have to listen to it. You can put up a boundary so that you can remove yourself from somebody who's harming you. Now, what do you do in situations where you have no control, right? Isn't it true? I mean, every day we read about new companies that are going to be going under. They're estimating 1/6 of all restaurants in Wisconsin are going to go under in the next 6 months. I read that. It's like, oh my goodness. All of these massive job losses. What if it's yours? What if you go into work tomorrow and you hear that your company where you work is headed for layoffs and you know that your job is about to be lost? Talk about out of control, right? Is that going to spin the dial up on anxiety for people? Going to bring a lot of anxiety, right? And it's beyond your control because you don't control somebody else hiring you, right? So what do you do in situations like this where you truly have no control? Well, even in that situation, you are not completely powerless. There are some things you can do, right? I've got a child right now who's looking at the loss of their job in the next 6 weeks. They're not completely powerless. They can update their resume. They can actually hire a professional resume writer to make their resume look better, right? Do you know that? You can do some things. They can make it their goal to apply for 10 jobs a day. They can do certain things. Now, they can't control whether or not anyone hires them, though. So when you're in situations like that, where it is completely beyond your control, then you do this. You submit to the God who is in control of everything. And you need to, the wording on that is precise, and I need to explain this to you. You submit to the God who is in control of everything. Be clear about what I am not saying here. It does not say you submit to the God who controls everything. He isn't making every human being do what he wants, right? Because it wouldn't be this messed up. He's not controlling every human being. He could. He could turn us all into robots and all suffering would end, but so would love. He is not controlling everything. But make no mistake about it, he is completely in control. And at any time, what he wants happens. At any time, what he wants will be done. And you see people in the Bible, I've said it over and over again. Let me just test you. Where do you go when life feels out of control and you need hope from God? Where do you go to hear the grace and love and power of God? There's one book in the Bible I say all the time to go to. It's always go to the book of Psalms. The biggest book right in the middle. Flip open your Bible to the middle and it'll fall to the book of Psalms, and you read about the power and control of God over and over again. Here's one example. The psalmist said, in the middle of craziness, my help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. What a simple sentence. I just made heaven and earth. That's all he did. Just made heaven and earth. Do you know what that sentence means? He made heaven and earth. You live somewhere on that planet, right there. From outer space, you're a speck. We can't even see you. He made heaven and earth, and he just breathed it out. It wasn't challenging to him. It wasn't exhausting to him. He wasn't tired when he did it. So do you honestly think the problem that you're facing is anxiety filling for God? It's like, oh no, you're going to lose your job? What am I going to do? He made heaven and earth. You think any problem in your life creates any level of anxiety for God? It makes no anxiety for God. None. And so many times, he allows these powerless situations to happen in our lives, not to hurt us, but so that we turn to God and experience the love and power of God in those moments. Because that's when we get it. Because he has made these kind of promises to you. Did you know that? He has said, in every moment, every situation you go through, I'll be with you. I will provide for all of your needs, not all your wants, but all your needs. I will bring good from everything you go through, and I am always at work on your behalf. Amazing promises. The God, think about this. The God who made heaven and earth has promised you that he's with you, he'll provide for you, he'll bring good from anything you go through, no matter what the other person intended, and he will always, always be at work in your life, every moment of your life. You may be aware of one or two ways in which God is working, and God is at work in hundreds of ways behind the scenes for you on your behalf. Did you know that? So many times, though, when we hit those situations where there's no control and things feel out of control, what we do is we turn to God and say, basically, you have no idea what you're doing. You are blowing it. That's what we say to God when we reel her at those moments. We accuse him of not keeping his promises. And then what happens later is so common. This is a common tale. I was talking to a friend once. And they were in a situation where financially they were in so much trouble. She was a stay-at-home mom and her situation changed. She simply had to go to work. Now, because of her education and her opportunities where she lived, she had to go to work at a job that she'd worked at in the past, and she hated it. Low pay, terrible circumstances. And she, in the weeks leading up to the start of that job, I talked to my friend multiple times, and she was so anxious and angry at God, truthfully. This is what happens. It's out of control. I got to control it. I'm going to do this thing. I don't want to do it. And God is blowing it. And that's how some of you feel today. Like God is blowing it. God doesn't know what's happening in your life. God isn't helping you. And the incredible thing is, she stepped back into this role. And over the next year, it was such a cool God thing. The environment where she worked before had changed. God actually wasn't out to hurt her. God actually had a beautiful plan for her. In the next year, she received promotion after promotion, raise after raise after raise, and a year after she took this job that she was so dreading and so anxious about, I was talking on the phone with her, and she has a whole new career because things got out of control and she had no choice but to do this. And what she had looked at a year ago as a curse from God, she was now a year later saying, God's so good to me. Because all of those promises were true in her life, every one of them. And so we talked on the phone about it for a while, and I said, yeah, do you know how many times in my life I've hit those moments where things were out of control and I didn't know what to do, and I was angry at God, and then time passes, and then he works like he promises that he's going to work, and I've had to go back to God and say, God, remember when I was complaining back there? I'm really sorry. Because this is really good and I can see it now. I should have trusted you. Some of you are in those places right now where life feels out of control, or a circumstance or situation feels out of control, and you don't have control. And anxiety is always a sign that you are trying to control something that belongs to God. And God brought some of you here for me to be able to say to you, God wants you to pray a prayer like this, to say, God, this feels out of control to me and I don't like this. But you've made these promises to me. You've promised that you're at work right now on my behalf, so before I can even see what you are doing, I want to say thank you. I want to demonstrate faith in the middle of a situation that feels out of control to me. And then you will see God work. I feel no hesitation about telling you that. I'm not worried about that statement being true or not true. It is absolutely guaranteed to be true, because the one thing that moves the hand of God is faith. And when you are in those times where it's out of control and you come to this point of surrender to Him and you say, God, it's out of control for me, but it's not out of control for you. Thank you that you're already at work bringing good out of this. Then you will see God. And you'll tell me a story in the future like my friend told me on the phone of how God worked. Because He can't lie. He can never lie. And everything He promised you is completely true. And anytime it's out of control for you, it is never out of control for the God who made the heavens and the earth. So you have two choices going forward, and I do not mean to make light of this. If you struggle with anxiety and your dial is spun high, I'm not trying to make light of these two choices, but you have two. You can try and control people and situations. You can try that. Matter of fact, some of you are. Some of you would say this about yourself. You know that you're a little bit controlling. Some of you would say it about the person sitting next to you, and you just let Jesus do His work right now. You don't need to say anything, don't point, don't nod, don't do anything, just let God do His work. But some of you know this about yourself. What if it's rooted in anxiety? It's hard to admit that, especially if you're a Christian. It's like, well, that's a bad thing. Well, it's just a natural thing. Not a bad thing. You don't need to judge it. It just is. But it doesn't have to be going forward. You have another option. You can focus on the things that you can control and turn control over to the God who is in control of everything and who just loves you. Who just loves you and wants you to experience His life with Him. Who has so much joy intended for you and so much peace for you. Maybe if you're here watching today, surrender is really a hard thing. I'm telling you right now, it is not a bad word. We obviously have a lot of bad context for it in our society, but not with God. Matter of fact, the relationship with God only begins at the point of surrender. There are a lot of people in our world today who are still living as if they can earn their way to heaven. If you ask them, what would you say to God when you died? They'd say, well, you know, I've done this good thing, and I went to church, and I was baptized, and I've done all these good things, as if they're going to present to God something that He's going to say, oh, well, you did all that. Well, welcome into my kingdom. That is their effort to try and control heaven. And as long as you believe any of that, you will miss it. Did you know that? God says the kingdom of heaven is available only to those who reach that point of surrender and say, God, I have nothing to offer you. Nothing. I have nothing in my life that's worthy of being with you. But you sent your Son to pay for my unworthiness. And Jesus, you died for me, and if you'll give me that gift of forgiveness, then you'll make me worthy. Let me have you bow your heads. Some of you have spent your whole life trying to earn it with God, and you can never earn it with Him. But if you will ask for it and give up the desire to earn it, He will just give it to you. And maybe this is the next step for you spiritually. With your head bowed and your eyes closed, you can say something like this to Jesus. Say, Jesus, I surrender. I give up. I can't earn it. If perfection is what it takes to be with you, I'm not and never will be. But Jesus, I heard you came into this world and then laid down your life for my imperfections. So instead of trying to earn it, I'm asking you to just give it to me. Please forgive me. Give me your gift of forgiveness today. I want to be a part of your family from this day forward. In Jesus' name, amen. As we finish up today, can I ask you all to just open your program again and take the card out of your program. If you're watching online, you can go to our website at penuelchurchlife.com and go to the Get Connected tab. We've heard from several people lately, and we're so glad when you write in to let us know. If you have prayed and asked Jesus to forgive us and you're watching online, just let us know, and we will send you some material in the mail as a follow-up. Or if you just prayed it here, just check the box, let us know what you've done, and then just drop this card in one of the 2 offering boxes back on the back wall where you came in. Thanks so much for coming. Hope to see you again next week.